Hello, and welcome to Russia Decoded, a podcast of the Center for the National Interest in Washington, D.C. My name is Andy Kuchins. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for the National Interest and a professor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. And I'm joined here virtually with my partner, Chris Monday, who is a professor of economics, at Dongso University in Busan, South Korea. But Chris is right now on a lengthy winter break from the university and back at his hometown in Los Angeles. Welcome, Chris.
Glad to be here.
Chris and I are veteran watchers of Russian news, and myself going back to the Soviet news days. And in fact, the intro music to our podcast was the theme music from the Soviet Vremya news program circa about 1986. So that will resonate with the old timers amongst our listeners. So the premise of the podcast is that we watch the Russian news, and in particular, the Vesti Nedeli program, the weekly program on Sunday evenings that's hosted by Dmitry Kiselev, which is News of the Week. It's a roundup of everything that goes on. The news, of course, is designed mainly for the Russian domestic audience, but it's also broadcasting to an international audience how Russia views itself and would like for the world to view it. Yes, it's a propaganda in many ways, but Chris and I believe that we can decode a lot of interesting things from watching the news. So that's for you, for our new listeners, and welcome to our old listeners. Chris, it's just been a head-spinning first 19 days of 2026 for those of us interested in geostrategy. The overriding theme this week, it seemed, is that Russia is kind of sitting back, enjoying watching the growing conflict in the transatlantic alliance over Greenland and other issues, but mainly Greenland this week. But the show opens with the long-running star, 26 years in running now, of Vesti Nedeli, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, speaking to the incoming group of ambassadors to Russia from all over the world. It's an annual meeting that Putin has to kind of certify the new group of ambassadors to Russia. And this was a moment for Putin to accentuate key themes that we've been hearing from him for at least nearly 20 years, starting with the Munich speech in 2007, but some of these themes actually going back to when he first came into power in 2000. And to summarize that, the world situation is degrading, it's deteriorating, increasing conflicts and unmanageability and difficulties in governing. The monologue, U.S. hegemony, is increasingly attempting to override dialogue and attempts at peace, and that might should not make right. There needs to be more emphasis on international law. Security is indivisible. It should never come at the expense of others. And he channels Dmitry Medvedev circa 2009, saying that there needs to be a new security architecture for Europe. There's nothing new here, and the new ambassadors the European ambassadors looking slightly more ill at ease than those from the global south, which constitute the great majority of those. Chris, I got to think that when Ukrainians, if anyone bothers to listen to this, hear Putin say stuff like that, it must make them sick on the verge of wanting to vomit. What's your take on this, Chris?
Putin's first important announcement after the new year, we see first there's no direct criticism of Trump. It's clear Putin's being very careful when he's told others to be careful to not antagonize Trump. He still wants to be an ally. But he does, of course, he's saying that the conflicts are growing, presumably this is caused by the U.S., and that the West is too, односторонний, that they're just looking out for themselves. They don't take account of others. And Russia is for dialogue, compromise. This idea repeats over and over again that we're just asking the right to be ourselves, to live in our own way without the dictates of the rest. For outsiders, it's a little strange. Well, what about Ukraine's right, to be itself? And it's a little hard to swallow. It just shows how Putin, he's in his own world. For me, I've been looking over some early Nazi propaganda. There was Hans Fritzsch. He was in the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. And it's just amazing. It struck me how similar what he was saying at the time sounds to what the Russians say. that it's the British imperialists are being they don't take account of others, and all we Germans want is the right to be ourselves. Sometimes it just sounds like they're just Google translating. Uh, this. And so I do wonder, for those who defend Putin, what they think of that. And then, of course, Putin he segs to Ukraine, which is strange, and he says that the West was ignoring the spravedlivi zaboty. The spravedlivi are just concerns. We have this spravedlivist. We have these just worries about Ukraine, and the West was ignoring this. The most important part was Putin met with the Taliban envoy, Gul Hassan, and this was featured prominently in the news. This was like the key part. It seems, of course, that Putin he's back into this idea, this great game that, well, the West is going to do some machinations and things, scheming in Iran, and well, I have Afghanistan, and I can pull that card. That seemed to be the implication, at least for me. There was the South Korean ambassador. The Russian news intoned, that now we're going to have a pragmatic approach. And of course, the South Korean, under the new president, they're opening up more ties to Russia. And so we could definitely see a lot of activity on that front. The main takeaway for me is that Putin, for now, he's waiting on the sidelines, and he seems like he's going to just wait and kind of benefit from the missteps of Trump. My take is Putin does not think the Trump approach is going to work so well, and he's going to be able to sit and kind of take advantage of some missteps, American missteps.
Well, I think that there are a lot of Europeans that would agree with Mr. Putin in that regard, that
Right.
Mr. Trump is taking some serious missteps that will resound to the benefit both of Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi in Beijing. So Europe is interspersed throughout the show, but it really does dominate the first hour, about half of it or almost half of it. So it kind of starts with the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz in a video saying, Russia is a European country, a part of Europe. The context in which Merz said that is unclear. And then the point is made that Russia has considerable friends in Europe. And there's lots of time then spent on Viktor Orban of Hungary and Robert Fico of Slovakia. And then they turn to Emmanuel Macron of France and Giorgia Meloni of Italy, who are suggesting that it is time for Europe to talk to Russia. But still, Europe refuses to do this. They're divided about it. And if they were to decide to do it, well, then who would take the lead anyway? Kind of echoing Henry Kissinger's comment back in the 1970s, who would you call in Europe? Who would answer the phone? The first name that came up, that was mentioned, is Alexander Stubb, the Prime
Hmm.
Minister of Finland. And there they turned to a quote from Mr. Putin at the recent, the Valdai Discussion Club meeting in October of last year, in which he kind of says offhandedly about Stubb, yeah. And they show a picture of Stubb with President Trump, and they're both holding their golf clubs. They're on the golf course. And Putin kind of says offhand, well, yeah, yeah, he's a good golfer, I hear, but, I don't think that golf is going to be enough to do this job. He's sort of
Yeah.
dismissive about it. But then later in the show, Chris, I mean, there's a remarkable segment near the end of the broadcast, essentially saying why Stubb or any Finn is not appropriate for the task, and a new documentary demonstrating why that is the case. Why don't you talk to our listeners about that, Chris?
It was very strange. So occasionally, you do see these anti-Finnish reports, but it's very rare. In general, the Russians like to play up their friendship with the Finns, and that they're kind of one people, and that we're part of the empire at one time. And so it was a strange segment, this historical excursion. The idea was that the Finns are at heart, they're racist, that we're working with Hitler to create a ethnically pure Russia, to break it up and put in, white Finns and things would run, parts of Russia. There was an attack on Gustav Mannerheim, who in this, according to this report, was also a kind of proto-Nazi. Of course, it's outrageous. There was the Molotov, and historical fact, there was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Stalin and Hitler, and it was Stalin, of course, who invaded Finland basically unprovoked. It's strange because I know I lived in St. Petersburg for many years, and Mannerheim is actually a very popular figure among the Russian right. He was trained in St. Petersburg. Was a Tsarist official. It was an odd report. Yeah, I think you're right. They're trying to downgrade Stubb as some kind of unifier of Europe. I think they're on to that Trump and Stubb have some kind of friendship, and maybe they're trying to get at that. But it's unclear exactly what the point of this report was.
Yeah, that's a good point to raise, Chris, that Gustav Mannerheim, when he was born in the 1860s, was, of course, Finland was part of the Russian Empire. It
Yes.
had a certain autonomous status and certain, national rights that other places like Poland did not have.
Yes.
With the documentary, we see the establishment of a German concentration camp, essentially by the Finns, apparently,
Yeah,
in and
this is the hack job, but it's
that's
not
a
not
that's
this.
okay. Like, good. I thought that was pretty bogus. It's odd because, we know. I remember when I first started going to the Soviet Union in the late 1970s, and at that time, Finland was, Finnish-Soviet relations, Finnish-Russian relations have generally been pretty good. Even the Soviet period, they were pretty good. The special status Finland had of, the famous term Finlandization. Well, I'm sure that the states of the Warsaw Pact would have been very pleased to be Finlandized. The standard of living was far higher.
Yes, yeah.
And typically, when we would go in and particularly coming out of the Soviet Union in those days, we would go through Helsinki. And man, when you hit Helsinki, it was like being in heaven after whatever period of time you'd have spent in the Soviet Union. Okay.
I would like to say, I'd recommend if you go to Russia, visit Viborg. It's a wonderful small town, but you really see there the contrast. That was the old part of the old
Right.
Swedish Empire, and you see how it's really degraded and fallen apart compared to, say, Finland. Exactly, and you can actually see from these areas, you can see how others live. Right, I can actually, from my apartment in St. Petersburg, we can see Finland, and there's just this stark contrast with how exactly what you're saying, how people live. It's no mystery to everyday Russians.
There was an interesting serial done in Finland within the last decade about some organized crime operation on the other side of the border, and there were a number of shots of Viborg now in Russian territory, and
Yeah.
no, things don't look so good there these days. Okay, but we're digressing. I guess we should get back to the main task at hand, and that's really Greenland. The title for the section on Greenland: the ice is starting to melt as the conflict within NATO deepens, particularly with Saturday's January 17th. By the way, we are recording on Monday, January 19th, and the Vesti Nedelj News was broadcast on January 18th. But with Saturday's announcement by Trump of the new tariffs against those states opposing the U.S. takeover of Greenland that are supposedly to start on February 1st, which marks, at least rhetorically, a major escalation of the conflict. It's honestly hard to say what is Donald Trump's endgame here with Greenland, but he's playing very hard, and it is dividing the alliance. As the Russians report, it's also provoking domestic political conflict in the United States, as a bipartisan legislation has been put forward in the U.S. Senate by Senators Jeanne Shaheen and Lisa Murkowski, calling for banning military conflict over Greenland. The Germans, the French, and the Brits late last week sent over 15 soldiers each to Greenland in a show of support. But I got to say, in my personal opinion, this looks pretty feckless. And then it looked even more feckless when the Germans returned immediately after landing. They'd hardly gotten off the airplane, and it's not been revealed why they were called back to Germany. But it's not a good look. And there's a certain split, I think, amongst the Europeans on this, although greater unity is developing as Trump's rhetoric hardens. Giorgia Meloni of Italy has shown advising caution. You need to take a cautious approach on Greenland. And then Vestiajelli, their usual punching bag, the European Union's foreign policy head, Kaja Kallas, former prime minister of Estonia, is reported making a great quote to her voters that, quote, now is a good time to drink, unquote. Something that I think most Russians would agree with. The point is also made about the ongoing disagreement within the European Union about the 90 billion euro assistance package to Ukraine and over how it's to be dispersed, especially the issue of U.S. or European arms to Ukraine, and also the fact that the agreed upon deployment of the 15,000 British and French troops in the event of an actual peace agreement in Ukraine that would be deployed to Ukraine, that in fact they would not be able to function without U.S. assistance. I think probably mainly intelligence assistance, but maybe logistical in other ways also. But it emphasizes the point that Europe is in a tough place. They're in between kind of a rock and a hard place, and that it would be a severe blow for European security if they were to break up NATO over Greenland. As I said earlier, Chris, it seems like Moscow is enjoying watching this conflict play out.
Yeah, you could imagine the Russian journalists must really compete over having this nice, easy story to report. Just kind of reports itself from the Russian perspective. What I found interesting was Vesti. They definitely take Trump's side in this conflict. Trump is trying to bring peace, and the European Union is sabotaging the peace process. They're backstabbing Trump. They keep saying, especially the English. The English got it. They're making a mess of things, and they're not letting Trump conduct his policies. There's hints for now. Russia could try to make a side deal with Europe, or try to side with Europe against Trump. Just slight hints for now. But I've heard Putin several times say, that, well, maybe we could make some kind of agreement with Germany. Of course, Putin's a German speaker. We saw Macron say, we need to have some kind of direct talks with Putin. And there was this last week, this prisoner exchange between French and Russian prisoners.
Right.
I do get the impression that there is this among some in the Kremlin, some hope that maybe they could make a French or German alliance, again against the United States. Also, it's interesting.
Kind of reminiscent of Jacques Chirac, Gerhard Schroeder, and Putin in
Yeah,
2003 in their opposition to the Iraq War.
yeah, you hear this in Russia. You hear this all the time, and there kind of hints of this for sure. I don't think it would go very far, but they're not closing the door to that. On Solovyov, of course, he's ridiculing the idea that Russia could ever attack Greenland. So there's a hint that they're kind of criticizing Trump as being absurd. It's very interesting. There's also at the end of the news broadcast, there's a strange report on a Soviet submarine, World War II submarine that sunk through to some errors, right? Sunk in Murmansk in 1940, and they really show that this was our error, the Soviet error, and this was covered up. The children of the sailors who died, they struggled to recover the memory of their parents. It's an odd story for Russian news to highlight, their own mistake. And I took it kind of as an implicit thing that we should be a little careful being too adventurous. That we should admit our own faults and maybe not try to do some sneaky things. It's definitely that seemed the implication here.
You mentioned earlier also, Chris, I mean, privately to me, and I thought it was interesting. This is near Murmansk. It's up in the Barents Sea.
Yeah.
It's adjacent to the Arctic region. Maybe there is something to this that operations in the Arctic are very challenging and difficult, and we need to approach them very carefully.
Of course, it could be some kind of criticism of Patrushev, who's running these Baltic missions. Nikolai
Hmm.
Patrushev. It's hard to say, but there's some kind of message being sent with that report.
Right. But it's hard to decipher in this one. Now the last before we segue to Ukraine, I thought Kiselev made a very telling point by showing the NATO bombing of Serbia in 1999, and he concludes, quote, "And this is a defensive alliance." Now, I have personally always argued that NATO's decision to operate out of theater, i.e., to operate outside of the area of the countries that are members of the alliance, in which was most strikingly represented by the 1999 war in Serbia, NATO war in Serbia, that this was at least as impactful on the Russians as was the expansion of membership that has garnered much more attention in the last 30 years. For me, expansion angered Moscow, but the Serbia war shocked them, making them feel extremely vulnerable. And maybe not surprisingly, Kiselyov pivots from this point directly to Russian military bombing of Ukraine.
Yeah. I can say I was in Russia in 1999, and it was just shocking for everyone. They just, I mean, they there was like a day people just couldn't speak. I mean, they just shock on their face. I was in class with all Russians, and even and there were liberals, and there were many liberals at this time, honest liberals, and they were just shocked, and they're just asking how can this be? How can you be bombing Serbia, and it was a big sea shift. This is one thing that definitely marginalized pro-American, pro-Western forces in Russia. You could just see it in their faces.
Yeah, I remember at the time many of my Russian analyst friends talking about, well, if NATO can do this in Serbia, an out of area, because of human rights violations and the right to protect, essentially, maybe they could attack the Russian Federation because of what's happening in Chechnya. Chris, why don't you take the segue now to Ukraine?
The Russian news, they really go into the details about Ukrainian politics. This has been going on since 2004. Sometimes it seems like you're in Russia, you're living in Ukraine rather than Russia. With Ukraine, they go into these details. So we see, of course, Yulia Tymoshenko. She's a very famous and well known to every Russian. So they leak a message. They have all these leaked messages where she complains about the Zelensky government, that it's turning towards fascism or something like this. And I think the implication is that, Tymoshenko, she was a darling of the West. She was on the cover of, Vogue and, hero of the Orange Revolution. And this is, for Russians, it shows like the hypocrisy of the West.
She's caught up in a corruption scandal,
Yes,
right?
yeah. And there's always this has been for years where, of course, there's Pavlo Lazarenko, was a famous, mobster kingpin who was arrested in the United States, and this was her patron. And
That's
Russians
right.
love to always show the hypocrisy. And there's always been rumors, of course, that she's actually been pro-Russian all along, or she's someone the Russians can work with. And so I took this as kind of a rumor that maybe perhaps Ukraine's trying to get rid of this pro-Russian faction as they head into elections. But it's a little hard to tell, especially watching the Russian news is not a good source for learning about Ukraine.
They love the part that she was, calling the Zelensky government a fascist government.
Well, supposedly, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, we always have to take what they say with a grain of salt. And then they go into great detail about the Zelensky and Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev, their dispute. And again, this just highlights how intricate the Russian knowledge of Ukrainian politics is. My feeling, of course, is that they're trying to convince the Trump administration to put someone, a so-called moderate in, for example, like Medvedchuk. I would not count that out. I
well, I'm
definitely
sure they want that.
Yes, they want that. They want that. They won't get that, but that's kind of the implication, you know. Let's get someone a common sense figure. Then they also highlight this report about the Ukrainian drones, a terrorist. You know, they when the Ukrainians attack, it's terrorism. You know, when Russia attacks, it's always just. Ukrainians attack, it's terrorism, and they bomb a tanker. But of course, this tanker wasn't Russia. This was Kazakh, you know, Kazakh oil. They play this up as some,
In the Black Sea.
yeah, big mistake on Ukraine's part. You know, driving a wedge between the allies. How true this is, I'm not sure. My take is, of course, they highlight some victories, some battlefield reports, but more and more, it's becoming increasingly unclear what the strategy of the Russians are. Where is the Russian army headed? What towns are they actually trying to take? And there's absolutely no talk of what land they want in the end. And there's no talk of what the peace deal would look like. And there's definitely no talk of how the economy is going to look. And you know, more and more, I'm getting this impression that there's a lot of bluff on the Russian side. I think they want a peace deal. They don't want to really move much further, you know, and it's in the West. We hear these, you know, military pundits say, you know, Russia's trying to take Odessa or take Kiev. I mean, this would just be disastrous from a Russian perspective. Horribly. I mean, they could pound some towns, but in the end, this would be counterproductive for long term growth for Russia. So I think Russia is actually they're ready for some kind of deal.
That is striking, Chris. I agree with you that Russian reporting never indicates a sense of what the broader strategy is.
Yeah.
It's all about this extremely incremental, almost microscopic territorial taking. And of course, in a lot of what they're reporting to be victories are actually, and if you look at the Ukrainian press, you look at the Institute for the Study of War and Western sources, that in fact, you know, Kupiansk, which they made such a big deal about 6 weeks ago, taking that, in fact, it's not fully taken. Mirnohrad, Dmitriev, that they made a big deal about this week. They're always having main mouthpiece, Vladimir Solovyov, who you mentioned earlier. You know, he's in the battlefield and he's there with the Russian flag at these victories in these completely destroyed parts of towns where there are no inhabitants and there seems to be nothing that is actually economically happening. We'll see. I guess we can hope that they're looking for a deal, but I wish they would look a little harder. So let me take you, Chris, you know, Viestina Jelly's take on Minneapolis. That was a feature on the show, the tragic shooting of Renee Good by the ICE officer. They make Minneapolis look kind of like a civil war is going
Yeah.
on.
Yeah, so this is a beloved theme for Russians is the chaos, the chaos in America. America, you know, for in the Russian eyes, America is it's a semi-war zone, and it's falling apart. The Russians that played up there's Garfield, very good film, Garfield's film Civil War, and many Russian pundits they predict that America is heading towards or almost in a de facto civil war. And I do worry. I think as Americans, we need to be very careful if something goes majorly wrong with Putin and Trump. I would not count out them actually trying to provoke a civil war. It's something we need to be mindful of. They're constantly hinting of this in these reports. So it's something Americans we need to take very seriously.
Well, there are a lot of Americans actually think that we're not that far off from a civil war, and then you look at what's happening in cities like Minneapolis and Portland and other places. The response to the George Floyd killing 5 years ago. I mean,
Yeah.
the loss of bipartisanship in the country. So it sounds like hyperbole, but
Well,
something.
my fear is the Russians they could push this along. They have a long experience of doing this, and
Yes, they do.
it's a fear.
Let's turn to Iran because them putting the Minneapolis story adjacent to the Iran story is not by accident. My take is that Vesti Nadeli reporting on Iran is that the phone call that took place between Putin and Iranian President Pezeshkian, who's Azeri, right? He's or has
Yes.
some Azeri blood, and actually Ali
Uh,
Khamenei. has
So this is Aliyev. He's pointed out several times that
Aliyev being the president of
they
Azerbaijan.
speak Azeri. Yeah, he's pointed that out, and the implication is that this would be a good leader. We should sideline the clergy and just let the president take over.
At any rate, Putin and Pezeshkian, they talked. That's kind of the lead, I think. The Russian support for the authorities in this case, the usual Kremlin take on socially mobilized opposition. They hate it. They didn't say anything about Iran for about 10 days. They got in late, and when they did, the tide had turned against the protesters. If you believe some reports, the Russians provided actually some material support for the regime. I don't
Yeah.
can't confirm that, but they're basically agreeing with Khamenei that Trump is to blame for his encouragement to the protesters. It was interesting to me, Chris, to note that it seems like Israel got kind of off the hook
Yeah.
here because Israel was right in line with President Trump. But at any rate, there's lots of fodder here for back channel discussions. I know one of your favorite themes. And finally, the last lengthy section on the Russian long time was Soviet and Russian imperial long-time involvement with Persia, Iran, and the Pahlavi family in particular. That's interesting and colorful.
Yes.
Seemingly, the point to me is that for being conveyed is that Russia was, is, and will be a major player in Iran.
Yeah.
What's your take?
Yeah. I completely agree. Putin, again, he's standing, he's waiting. Perhaps he's directly given orders to Vesti to not be too provocative, not say too much. It's mainly the reporting is very neutral and very sparse. I mean, they put at the end of the news. There's no mention. I mean, clearly Russia is involved in these backstage agreements with Turkey, Azerbaijan, of course, Israel, but there's no mention of this at all. Who's agreeing to what, and what's going on. Putin, he wants to keep these agreements. He wants to keep them undercover. He's not going to be the one talking about them. It's interesting. There's a Gray Zone report. So Gray Zone is the site that often has very pro-Russian provocative reports, and there's a big report on how the Mossad is all behind all these things. They're doing everything. A lot of conspiracies, but we don't hear that at all in the Russian media. There's no mention of Israel, just none. Just doesn't
Well,
exist.
it's hard to believe that Mossad could be behind, all of these demonstrations taking place in major cities across the country.
I mean, for many Russians, this would be an easy story, and it'd
Yes,
be
yes.
very
I agree with
believable.
that.
My take is, of course, that Russia, they have to be very careful with these ethnic and religious issues.
Yeah.
There are many Jews in prominent places in Russia, and of course, there's many hostile. There's the Muslim community, and there's been riots, and so
Absolutely.
they're very reluctant to touch any of these religious. There's many Azerbaijanis, there's many people from Central Asia, of course, Chechnya, and the Russian news, they've been told clearly, do not touch this issue. So what they show is that, of course, the protests, of course, they're not spontaneous. They're all staged. They're all being helped along, but it's not clear by whom, who's doing the helping. They don't say. Yeah, of course, they focus on the violent. The protests are violent. Russian media, any street protest is always bad,
Oh,
violent,
they're terrorists.
chaos. And then, of course, it's very interesting. They focus on the Starlink. The Starlink was given especially to the protesters, some kind of scheme. Iran was able to counteract the Starlink to decode it, decrypt it, and of course, the rumor is that this was Russia that helped do this, but it's not clear. There's also, I'd say, the biggest one. What a lot of this is about is, of course, the Iranian nuclear program. I think that we've agreed to shut it down with the Russians, but there's just no mention of nuclear program. Uh,
Right. None at all.
I think that's the agreement that's being made is, we'll kind of lay off Iran, but they better shut down that program. And my bet is that Putin, he's agreed to this. I think he's agreed to this, and that's why he wants to keep clean hands. He this is the West doing all these things, and he's not. Ya ni pri чем. I don't have anything to do with it at all. He's a clean guy. So again, Trump he wants to wait out the situation and then
Putin
jump
wants to
in
wait
and
out
take
Trump.
advantage. Yeah, take advantage of things. That's what
Yeah,
he's doing.
that sounds like a Putin play. And then
Yeah.
from Iran, we come back to Latin America. And there's a very kind of romantic and nostalgic report in many ways from my old friend Sergei Brilyov that we talked about last week on the show, who was a longtime announcer, a leading announcer on Vesti back in the 2000s and into, well, actually up until about 2022, as we discussed. But the
Fluent
reports
Spanish speaker.
on
Fluent
Venezuela
Spanish.
and Cuba, mostly Cuba, and it starts with the funeral ceremonies for the fallen Cuban soldiers who were killed defending Maduro. And when I say romantic, it starts with a sun setting over Havana, the city of liberty, of freedom, city of freedom, and this beautiful song that was written, I think in the late 50s, early 60s, in honor of Fidel. Brilov, who is now much more tanned and bearded than when I knew him about 10 years ago. He was born in Cuba, and he loves Latin America, and I think he feels really at home. He mixes in his report, he mixes with the demonstrators in Havana. He interviews a guy carrying a Soviet flag who apparently had fought in the Cuban brigade with the Soviets, likely in Africa. There's a lot of nostalgia for Soviet-Cuban relations relayed. He reports, of course, back on to Venezuela on the Maria Corina Machado meeting with Trump in the White House last week when she gave her Nobel Prize to Trump and really got nothing in return for it, at least yet. And then Sergei turned to Mexican leader Claudia Sheinbaum, who has promised to provide Cuba with oil supplies to replace, at least in part, those of Venezuela. We'll see whether that actually transpires. But, Brilov seems genuinely concerned for the future of Cuba, the Cuban people. And it's interesting that there is no indication that Russia will do anything to help them, or Venezuela for that fact. And something, Chris, tells me that Sergei is not very happy about that. And maybe this report, in some way, is a plea to Moscow for them to help the Cuban brothers again. What's your take on all this?
Yeah, there's definitely this feeling of nostalgia, and that this is a kind of faded empire, faded place. He does mention a lot is their own fault, the Cubans' own mismanagement. He does say that,
Yeah.
and it seemed to me like they're getting ready, they're prepping the Russian public for some kind of deal where Trump basically takes over Cuba, the regime falls, and there's some kind of regime change. Of course, they do not mention Sechin and Rosneft and Russian business interests that are in Venezuela and Cuba. And my bet is, of course, there's going to be a lot of horse trading, and that's going to be most important for the Russians. Keeping their business interests. There's also a slight implication again that Putin, if things go wrong, they could turn all of the Americas against the United States. They focus on Sheinbaum and she's in Mexico, and her that she's a little wary of the America and Putin, and talking to Lula in Brazil. And so I think there's maybe in the works there's some kind of idea that we could make some kind of anti-American coalition in the Americas if things go wrong.
There's some mixed feelings there, I
Yeah,
think. On one hand, there's kind of an acknowledgement that the Russians really aren't in a position to do much to
yeah,
help.
that's the main
Um,
thing.
but they're never really ready to fully accept that. But
Yes.
so from there, the report turns to China, which already is damaged by losing access to Venezuelan oil supplies and possibly Iranian if Trump were to intervene there. I think the unspoken message here, Chris, might be that China is becoming more dependent on Russian oil supplies in the event of both of these things happening. Chinese interests have been damaged. They're very unlikely to get paid back the 10 billion in loans to Venezuela. that they've made. And
I think they're also saying, Trump, he's fighting China, but he's not fighting us. He's not fighting the Russians.
it's
He's fighting China. This is
you're
about
right.
China.
You're
And
right.
so we can, Trump, Putin's got a good plan to just stay out of it for now.
Then there's the accent, the meeting in Beijing between Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and Xi last Friday, in which agreements were signed. I think that visit must have been scheduled before the Venezuelan operation. But the oil connection and the political relations between Canada and China have certainly been elevated. Chris, we'll follow that one. We always may be reading too much between the lines, but it feels like certainly ambivalence on the Russian part in some regards towards China, and maybe even friction. I don't know. So, Chris, there was a curious report at the end in Buryatia about the replacement in Buddhist religious ceremonies with the Buryat language over Tibetan, and religious issues more broadly, including shamanism. It's quite interesting. Why are they talking about this now?
Of course, the Russians, they make a big point of that they're very tolerant towards all the
Yes.
people. There's a lot of Orientalism, these primitive, so-called primitive peoples with their traditions, and there's a hint that they have some secret powers or something. Of course, there's also a large it's no coincidence, this is with China, anti-Chinese. Look at how the Chinese are clamping down on Tibet, and we're promoting all the Buddhism, and we're much more tolerant. We're not China. We're much better. We're very tolerant. Russia has a lot of Tibet specialists. I think if things go wrong with China, they might use this card for sure. Russia, they're always, thinking ahead towards these, future conflicts. And of course, it's very sad. These Baratia, this is one of the many peoples that have been sucked into the war with Ukraine. Putin's been very careful not to have people from the cities, Russian from the cities, go fight. It's these ethnic groups, people from the provinces, prisoners. It's a sad thing.
Yeah, I think that's right. He's expressing on the one sort of a domestic side to it, expressing some sensitivities towards the Buryat people, who are certainly much more highly represented as a percentage of the Russian military forces in Ukraine, and also the China angle. So at this point, it's time for us to turn to our last segment that we do weekly, and that is dogs that do not bark. What is the Russian news not reporting about? And there are a few things that caught me, kind of similar to last week. There's really no talk about the Ukraine negotiations. It's certainly on the U.S. Russian side. Now, this is interesting because the Ukrainians, the new chief of staff to Zelensky, Kirill Budanov and Muslim Umerov and other Ukrainians met with Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff in Miami on Saturday, January 17th. And Witkoff and Kushner are scheduled to meet tomorrow on the 20th in Davos with Kirill Dmitriev. Nothing reported on this. And it suggests to me what we've been talking about, that Putin is kind of biding his time. And then we look
Yeah.
at Davos more broadly. The big news for this next week is that Donald Trump is going to Davos. There's nothing said about Davos. You expect a lot of fireworks. The Russians are treating this now kind of like a non-event. Maybe since major Russians most likely are not going, of course, with the exception of Kirill Dmitriev, that I expect this to be a significant story next week.
Davos used to be a major story in the headlines. This was like they're part of the West, and I just that they're very bitter. Russians are bitter about that.
Yeah.
I would like to mention there's on the internet making the rounds. There's two very strange interviews with a so-called insider, Karaganov. So this is on Tucker Carlson and Glenn Dyson's show. And Karaganov, he makes these I mean, they're just way over the top claims about, Russia being ready for nuclear war and conducting some strike to restore deterrence. And they present as just very misleading. I don't like to say disinformation, but I mean it's based. This is what it is. This Karaga, he's an insider, and he's talking with Putin all the time. It's just not true. It's just not
And
true.
the nuclear stuff.
So, yeah, Karaganov is saying, Russia is basically ready to, launch a nuclear strike, any day now, or, it's craziness. One, we do not see Karaganov at all on the Russian news. They kept him off. And clearly this is done, by the FSB, the Russian intelligence to push this guy on the foreigners, let him fool the foreigners. And then we keep him out, we keep him in hands and keep him out. No, it's a trick to keep him
No,
out
it
of
is. Absolutely.
Russian news because they know they'd get immediate pushback. Putin's been told not to play the nuclear card. Modi and Xi have told him explicitly, don't do this. If there actually was any move towards this, I mean, there'd be threats of a preemptive strike. That Russia would get in a lot of trouble. It's just nonsense. There's actually questions. Would the nuclear forces actually obey Putin if he moved towards something like this? And then Karaganov, he's in reality, this is a marginal figure. He spreads these weird conspiracy theories. And I remember, so I watched this during COVID. This is, I believe, 2020 to 2020. This is Dmitry Kiselov. He had a long broad report on Karaganov as a charlatan. We can't listen to this man. This is a charlatan. So if he was an inside Putin advisor, I mean, you never. This is something you would never see. And in
Exactly.
general, of course, the Putin advisors they do not talk to foreigners.
I've known.
You
I
don't.
completely agree with you. I've known Karaganov for more than 35 years, and he's really not my favorite Russian. And
Yeah.
it does irritate me that so many Westerners, take the clickbait of what Karaganov says, and they take it seriously. And
Oh, yeah.
look at who's promoting it. I mean, this is like, two of the Kremlin's useful idiots in Tucker Carlson and Glenn Dyson. So basically, it's yeah, well, just disregard. I think we need to wrap up, Chris, for this week.
Yes.
We covered a lot of territory. It's been a lot of fun. I hope you listeners have enjoyed the discussion, and we hope that you join us again next week to see what's taken place, what's new, and what's not reported on. Thanks so much. See you soon.